Te mea tuatahi mihi kia tātou e ngā rangatira, ko tai mai nei te pōnei, ki roto i tēnei huihuinga o tātou. Tō tēnei tō tātou kōrero mō tēnei māuiutanga e hama nei a tātou puta no te motu. O reira e mihi ana kia tātou, ko tai mai nei te pōnei. O reira kia karaki a tātou i runga te ingoa te matua, te tama, te wairua tapu āmini. Te atua ko koe e mui a mātou, ara tuku whakawete tuna kia koe o manaki tangarunga i a mātou tēnei pōro to tēnei huihuinga. Ia tautunu tō rangi Māria, i roto o mātou ngākau, hei mautunu i a mātou roto tēnei kōrero. Kia inoi tuna na mō ngā mea mohe nei mātou i roto ngā hohe pere e māuiuna tēnei pō, kia tautunu tō rangi Māria e runga i a rātou. A runga i a mātou hoki i puta noa te motu, a o mātou rangatira o tā mai nei tēnei pō. Haka klore e ngia tō ingoa ngā wā kato i kaitiuki tō mātou araki. Āmeni.
Welcome to our event tonight. So, Matthew, I'll hand it over to you.
Kia ora, thank you very much for that, Janice, and thank you, Hone, for that wonderful karakia to kick us off this evening. No mai hore mai whānau, wherever you are across this great land of ours, of course, Aotearoa, New Zealand, welcome to what is really essentially a special event put on by our whānau, our colleagues, our comrades at the Public Service Association. And can I, just before we kick off, say what an absolute honour and a privilege to be here with all of you this evening. You know, our public service workers do an incredible amount of work right across New Zealand, no matter whether you're in our schools, our hospitals, our health centres, our kindergartens, our government agencies and departments. So thank you very much for being there on the front line with us and for us as we navigate these tough times, obviously, of COVID-19. Joining me this evening is my co-host, Ofeina Manuel-Barbarich. Kia ora there, Ofeina.
Kia ora.
Now, Ofeina and I are going to be double teaming this wonderful event this evening. Of course, we're joined by some incredible New Zealanders, incredible people who are going to bring you the facts and the truth, if you want to call it that, or whatever it is in terms of the questions that you've been posing to the PSA over these last few days in anticipation of this webinar. Of course, I'm talking about the incredible Siouxsie Wiles. I mean, who doesn't want to give her a bit of a, you know, all might to paki for Siouxsie Wiles. And of course, we've got Tina Ngata from the great province over there. I think it's in the Tairawhiti over there. And of course, the incredible Dr Collin Tukuitonga, who all of you will know amongst our Pasefika whānau in particular for all of his incredible mahi when it comes to our Pasefika whānau right across the country, right across the motu. Just some numbers to reset this and provide some context. There are currently 15 community cases announced today in terms of the latest outbreak. There are roughly about 3.1 million New Zealanders with their first dose administered, about 1.6 million with their second dose administered, 75% of the eligible population with one dose and 40% of the eligible population with two doses. And as we track towards what the Prime Minister said this afternoon, it's now our role to really kick this up a level and into a gear, which is why we're all here tonight to answer your questions. But Ofeina, what sort of message would you like to send as we get ourselves underway?
Kia ora, Matt. First of all, malolele, ko kinga ko Ofeina Manuel-Barbarich, and I co-convene our PSA Pasefika network along with Uluwalo Mareko, who's also listening in this panel. I hail from the Kingdom of Tonga, from Kolomotua, Folaha, and Ha'apai. I guess my message for tonight is just keeping an open mind and remembering that we're talking about COVID-19 and the vaccination within our PSA and employment context. And it's really exciting to have some amazing people on this panel who will be able to support us and support us in terms of our thinking about not just our employees or employers, but also our communities. So definitely from Māori, Pacific, and greater New Zealand, Aotearoa context. Koe be malo.
Kia ora. Hey, thank you for that, and so great to have you joining me tonight. We're double teaming, as you know. But what we'd like to do is now just get the conversation going, and ask each one of our speakers this evening to introduce themselves, and also talk a little bit about what they're seeing in their own communities and across the motu. Hey, so to kick us off, I thought I'd start off with Dr Siouxsie Wiles. Siouxsie, welcome.
Kia ora, and thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to everybody today and hopefully answer some questions. So yeah, I'm Siouxsie Wiles. I'm a microbiologist at the University of Auckland, and I've spent 20 odd years studying infectious diseases. I'm really interested in the microbes themselves, you know, exactly how they do what they do. My speciality is in bacteria rather than viruses, but bacteria are actually way more complicated than viruses. So it's not so difficult to apply some of the same thinking to viruses as well. And I guess what I've seen my role during this pandemic has been to try and help New Zealanders understand how the science has been changing, you know, just so that we can make really good decisions for ourselves. I was asked to talk about a few things sort of first, like what my main messages would be. And I have a couple of things that I really want to talk about. So the first is I get asked questions a lot about, you know, how quickly these vaccines have been developed. You know, how can it be that just, you know, like it's what, 18 months or something, less than 80, you know, less than 2 years since we started this pandemic. How can we have vaccines already when it usually takes years and years? And it's a really, really great question. And the answer is money. So normally it takes a very long time for medicines and things to make their way through the different stages of trials and things. Partly because after each stage of trial, there's usually several years where everybody tries to figure out who's going to pay for the next phase. So, you know, so there's normally like a phase 1 trial, which sort of looks at sort of doses and initial safety. And then there might be a few years delay, and then they get the phase 2 trials, and then there'll be some more delay, and then there'll be a phase 3 trial. And then at the end of that, there's this long phase where all of the information from those trials, plus also information from animal studies, is given to all the regulators to then have a look at and say, okay, so do we want to, you know, approve this particular medicine or vaccine? And then after that, there's another delay while the companies start manufacturing whatever it is that has been approved, because basically there's no point them starting to manufacture something if they might not get approval for it. So that process normally can take anywhere from sort of 5 to 15 years. So the reason things have happened so fast during COVID-19 is because governments all around the world just said, whatever money you need, like we'll pay for stuff. And the trials, instead of happening one after the other with these long delays in the middle, actually sort of went in a sort of staggered but slightly parallel way. So the phase 1 trial started, and as soon as it was looking good and safe enough, the phase 2 trial started. And then as soon as they were looking good enough, the phase 3 trial started. So all of those trials finished. In fact, the phase 3 trials will carry on for a while, because we want to know, you know, how long do people's antibodies last for a couple, you know, so they'll be followed for a couple of years. But at the same time, also, all the data from all those trials was given to the regulators so that they could look at it as they were going along instead of waiting till the end. And then at the same time, companies and governments, I guess, gave the companies the money to start manufacturing the vaccines. So even though they might not have made it through the trials, if they did make it, then they would be ready to go. And so that streamlining of that process shows us that we can get drugs and vaccines to people who need them in like 18 months, which I think is just amazing. There's no way I would have thought that possible. And it's really because the need has been there and the money has been there. So no corners have been cut. It just shows what I think we can achieve when money is no object. And I really wish we learn from this and apply this to lots of other things. And then the other thing I think that's really important is that these vaccines, so we're using new technology. It's not technology that is really concerning. It's based on decades of laboratory research. And they were ready to go into human trials before, but there's never been a problem that was serious enough for people to invest in that technology. And so here was a problem that was big enough that basically the money went in. So it's kind of sad, because we could have potentially had vaccines for lots of other things based on this technology before. So I think that probably that's where I'll end. I'm sure we can get into lots of the other questions that people have, but that's sort of one that I wanted to put out there, because it's a question that I get asked a lot, I think, and it's got, you know, it's certainly something that I think people are, you know, certainly very easy to get worried about that kind of thing.
It is, and it is a big question for a lot of people. I mean, at the moment, we're still struggling to cure some of the bigger diseases that have been around for a very long time. And a lot of people have said, well, hang on, how has it been this quick? I mean, can we really trust this? But I mean, really what you're saying is the world is facing a global together sort of challenge, and harnessing our resources, we've come together to make this happen. Wouldn't it be great if we did that with a whole lot of other diseases as well? Right?
And I think one thing that should put people's minds at ease is that when so we've actually messed up as well, because we're not making the vaccine available to everybody. So 75% of the world's doses have gone to just 10 countries, and they are the richest countries. So if you don't think this vaccine works, look at who's taking it, look at who's buying it, look at who's hoarding it. It's the rich countries, it's the rich white people who are hoarding this stuff. And that is a travesty, because it is awful that people are now even talking about boosters when there are so many countries around the world that haven't even got access to their first dose yet. So while, and this is something that really makes me angry, because governments all around the world have kind of put money into this, you know, developing this technology. It's looking amazing. And then basically the companies are not sharing that technology and allowing it to be, you know, allowing vaccines to be made all over the world where they're needed. So it's a from me.
No, good on you. You keep going. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, in our own neighborhood in the Pacific, a lot of our Pacific whānau live right here in Auckland, for example. And at the end of the day, just because they might be small in number in terms of the islands doesn't mean to say they're unequal, or you know, we shouldn't be running the whole equity argument. Same with Māori communities, but that we're going to get to that with our next guest, I suspect. Tina, Ngata, welcome. So tell us about what's going on in your neck of the woods. I mean, you know, you're a very, I would call you one of our doyons of wahine toa. I'm so proud of the work that you do in advocating on behalf of Māori as well. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in your neck of the woods. What are you seeing, and in terms of our whānau's response?
Thank Matthew. Tēnā koe, o tira tēnā koutou, mā loe lele. Tā lofa kia orana, mi sabula manaka, he mihi tēnei te tuatahi kia koe matua hone nāhau kua whakawātea ko tātou ara I raro I te marumaru o te wāhi ngaro nei rā ka mihi kia koe o tira kia koutou, kia kōrua, Matthew, kōrua ko Ofeina, tēnā kōrua. Ko tēnā ngata tōku ingoa, he uri tēnei no te tai rāwhiti, no reira ko hikurangi te maunga, ko Waipu te awa, ko Ngāti Porou Tiwi, tēnā koutou. Thank you so much for the invite to come and spend some time. Lovely to see you, Susie. Lovely to see all of you here tonight, and to finally be in the same space as you, Matt. See a lot of your work around the place as well. And so, yeah, it's you know, such a vital topic for us right now. I don't think in our generation we've ever had a, you know, such, I guess you could call climate change an existential crisis, but it is a slow moving existential crisis. And so, you know, for our generation, this is really, I think, something that we've had to face, that the last couple of generations have probably not had to deal with in the same way. But if we look back across time, we see that pandemics and epidemics and how they've impacted our tipuna and impacted generations. Oh, you know, polio, even probably like in the 60s, I know that polio, 60s and early 70s, there was still some polio epidemics that were really severely impacting upon particularly impoverished, usually Māori and Pacific communities in Aotearoa. And I was looking the other day at a chart, and from the early 1800s up until now, there's been some 73 pandemics and epidemics, and unfailingly it has been us, it's been Māori who have been worst impacted in Aotearoa by that. And of course, because of our shared kind of health profiles and our shared social experiences, it's Māori and our moana whānau our wānatoa who are also who are impacted in very similar ways. So these are histories, I think, that we carry in our bones, that we carry a deep knowing about, and a very instinctual response about. And it's something that kind of really made us sit up and pay attention when we first heard about COVID-19. So here in Tairāwhiti, I live in Wharekahika, which is the far East Cape. About 5 minutes walk from me, there's a mass grave of children who died in the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic. And we also have stories, nannies who are named after, you know, the amount of deaths, mate kino, mate roa, all of these kind of names that come from the deep and severe level of loss that we had back then. And we also had interesting stories from our tipuna at that time that they actually went out and set up checkpoints in the 1920, when it came back for the second wave in 1920. And it was those checkpoints that actually saved us from being devastated in the way that we were in the 1918 wave of the Spanish influenza epidemic, which is I studied in Māori visual arts and public health, which is a weird combination, I know, but I really wanted to understand when I was at university how well-being for us was different to standards of well-being, the dominant standards of well-being. So I wanted to know how culture fitted into well-being. I wanted to know how art fitted into well-being, and I wanted to know how environment fitted into well-being, and other forms of well-being, our hauora wairua, our spiritual well-being, and all of that. And I wound up working for Pa Mason jury at Massey University on a study called Te Hoi Nukurua. And so that exposed me to all of these different forms of well-being. I wound up working in environmental health, and before too long landed in the space of doing rights advocacy for environmental well-being and Indigenous well-being. And I've been doing that for quite a few years now. In relation to what's happening here in the East Cape, as I said, you know, we looked deeply into our own history and tried to understand what COVID-19 and what pandemics and epidemics meant for us in relation to our history. We saw that, you know, we couldn't wait for others to come and save us, because that's traditionally, we're one of the last ones that they think about, not only because we're Māori, but also because we are rural and isolated. And we're so far away, and we're just out of sight, out of mind. So we knew that we had to front foot our response. We knew that we had to protect our community. We did put up checkpoints in order to protect our community, but that's just one of the more visible things that we did. We were also really proactive in getting good information out to our whānau. And we really strongly believed that with good information, our whānau would make good decisions. And a part of that was about helping our whānau to stay home, because we could see through the checkpoints how mobile people were being. Not just, you know, tourists, but also some of our own. And we're asking questions around, well, what is it why are you out today? What are the things that we can do to help you stay home during lockdown? But also just making sure that there was good quality information going out to our whānau was a really big part of the checkpoints. And so when misinformation, this was very early on in last year's lockdown, when we started to see misinformation about the virus coming out, and misinformation also about, you know, masks and lockdowns, and then eventually vaccines as well, we were kind of already in the space of considering, well, how do we protect ourselves from that information? Because decision making for us, you know, that's a treaty affirmed right, the ability to self-determine. If you want self-determination, that means quality decision-making, right? And quality decision-making only happens when you have quality information. And so for us, it became a process of really clearly defining for us what does quality information look like? Who does it come from? Where does it come from? How do we test it? how do we validate it, and then how do we share it with each other as well. So that's a journey that we invited Siouxsie and colleagues on Te Pūnaha Matatini to join us on as well, and other people as well, Dr. Rawiri Jansen, Dr. Rawiri Taonui, other trusted storytellers as well. And then we went about going into wānanga spaces to understand that. Now, the outcomes of that for us has been, you know, well, for our over 25s, for our 25 and older age group, adult age group, we are past 90% vaccinated now for Matakawa region. And we're now focusing strongly on our rangatahi cohort. And when I say that, you know, that's nobody's forced anybody to do anything, but that's everybody has self-elected to do that. And it's been a process, you know, a long process of wānanga, trying to have understanding and empathetic conversations that take into account that actually not trusting authority is kind of, that's been our survival mechanism in the face of colonization for so long. So you can't expect people to blindly trust authority. So what are the other ways that we can go about making sure that we've just got good information? And that's been the journey that we've been on, and it's so far helping us with our vaccination efforts. But it also has all of these other kinds of unexpected and unplanned for benefits as well. It's enhanced our kotahitanga as a community. It's brought us closer together. It's helped us to deal with other forms of misinformation as well, and to consider what the information scape, the ever-changing and growing information scape means for us as Māori, and how do we respond to that in a way that draws from who we are and the histories that we come from.
Yeah, you make so many good points, because at the end of the day, a lot of our people who have bought in early to misinformation and the stories that are going on around the internet and so on and so forth, it doesn't make them bad people. It's just that they're reading the wrong stuff. They're getting it from the wrong messenger. It doesn't make our whānau bad. And it's great to hear that our people are stepping up also, people like you with leadership roles, really starting to put the right information out there, and have been in that really Māori way, wānanga, but also I love the downstream positive aspect of this, which is kotahitanga, which is a big thing for us, of course. Hey, now, Ofeina, I'm going to ask you to introduce our next speaker, Collin, because I tell you, this is the other part of what we're dealing with too, and that's embracing into our korowa, if you like, our Pasefika whānau, as well as our Māori whānau.
Whakaawelahi, Matt. I just want to say a big whakaalofa atu to Dr. Collin Tukuitonga. Dr. Collin is the Associate Dean Pacific and Associate Professor of Public Health at the University of Auckland, and he's also a member of the Health Quality and Safety Commission Board, amongst other amazing things that he does for the community, especially our Pasefika whānau. So Dr. Collin, welcome and good evening to you. I guess the challenge for you, or this is an opportunity for you to just share with us your thoughts around the importance of vaccination and some of your key messages before we get into the questions that some of our viewers have submitted.
Well, kia ora koutou and whalofalahi atu. It's a pleasure to be here. Today I was at an event organized by the Niue community and the health workers, doctors and nurses who are of Niuean descent, where they organized a drive-in event and invited the Niuean whānau and anyone else who want to come along and get vaccinated. Just up the road at the Atu Hall, our cousins from the Cook Islands were doing the same thing at the Atu Hall, organized and delivered by the Cook Islands health professionals and communities, supported by some of our recognized Pacific providers. And on Friday at the Mangere Town Centre, the Samoans are doing the same. Now, just over 2 weeks ago, the Tongans probably set the bar with a massive event where they vaccinated almost 4,000 people over a period of 3 days. I say this because I've been bleating on from day one about how boring, predictable, convention, ineffective the rollout has been if you're Māori or Pacific. There was a big hoo-ha and rah-rah-rah with a mass event at the Manukau Center a while back, and we knew it wasn't going to do the job for us. We ended up fantastic that there were 16,000 people vaccinated, but in fact, there was just barely 1,000 Māori and 1,000 Pacific. So in effect, the policy was prioritize Māori and Pacific. The reality was anything but. And so these community-led initiatives is really the community's response to an ineffective, conventional approach by officials. And there hasn't been enough trust and respect of these communities by officials to allow people, to enable people, to empower and resource communities to do this for themselves. Because I think this is what's needed. Siouxsie referred earlier to 10 countries, 10 rich countries hogging most of the vaccine. In Aotearoa, there's a microcosm of this very same thing. The people most at risk, Māori and Pasefika people, are the ones with the lowest vaccination thus far. And guess what? We keep repeating the same old stuff that we've known before that is not as effective. And so some of you will have probably seen me bleating on in the papers and television and radio to anyone who would listen that we needed to be more creative. We needed to work with our communities. We need to trust our communities. We need to respect them and enable them to deliver the goods. Fortunately, it is encouraging that the numbers are finally improving. I mean, Te Whānau o Waipareira some weeks back delivered massive numbers, and they continue to do that. Why didn't we do this from day one, is my point. Because obviously vaccination and getting as many of our whānau, all of the people of Aotearoa vaccinated, that's one of the fundamental things that's going to keep people safe and improve our chances of getting close to some form of normality so people can live their lives. Because one of the unfortunate consequences of this lockdown, of course, is that most Pasefika people, the majority of people have lost their jobs and incomes, or many of them are Pacific and Māori. So it's not just a health issue, it's also, it affects people's lives and livelihoods. My key message to the Pasefika community, the young people, is you're not actually bulletproof. This is not something they want to hear from me, but I'm going to say it. Our problem is that our young people are not coming forward. So we've tried to be as creative as we can be. And there's a TikTok competition for young Pasefika, young Niueans, that we're trying to communicate with them. And as I say, unfortunately for us, the younger you are, the less likely you are to be vaccinated in our communities. The good thing for us is that our kaumatua, our older people, the coverage uptake is actually reasonably good and almost comparable to other groups in New Zealand. So clearly for us, it's the young folk that somehow we've got to work with, encourage, support, inform, do the best we can with all that crap they learn off of Instagram, because that's the group that we need to get to. They're at increased risk, as you know. Majority of cases in recent times are Pacific, by the way. 70% of the cases this time around are Pacific, and increasing numbers of Māori, but also young people. And this is the story of inequity. This is the story of disadvantage. And we knew in 1918, 1957, 2009, the same story. The most disadvantaged are the ones most severely affected. So when we're out of this, in whatever form that takes, it's going to be clear that yet again, the inequities that have long persisted in Aotearoa will come back and tell us that this is a fundamental problem that we need to address. There's going to be another pandemic called something else, we're sure of that. But if we don't fix the underlying socio-economic housing, jobs, employment, empowerment, information, we'll see the same old thing repeated. Sorry to be the bringer of bad news, but I did start off by saying we're doing it for ourselves, and there'll be more of these community-led initiatives, the Fijians shortly, and then the smaller communities of Tuvalu, Tokelau, and Kiribati early next month. So, and there will be more of these, I'm certain, because I think these are clearly going to be the options that work for people. Kia ora, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, kia ora, thank you for that. If I could just say, it's okay. But you raised some really good questions, points about what is it we're trying to do here and how do we motivate, and particularly our young people, our children, our tamariki, our mokopuna, for all of those who are tuning in, to get out there and actually say, you know what, we're not bulletproof. So what more can we do to get them out there? But first, let's turn our attention to some questions that have come through on how the safety of the vaccine itself. And Dr. Siouxsie Wiles, I tell you, the country knows more about microorganisms and stuff than I ever thought was possible. But hey, that's a win for science. Can we ask you a couple of questions to start off with, Siouxsie, just about, say, for example, how safe is this vaccine? There's a bit of misinformation out there. I mean, I've had my 2 jabs. I put my pen to my forehead. It's certainly not magnetized me. Tell us, how safe is the vaccine?
So I guess I do want to start by addressing the misinformation. So a really, really important statistic that I think people can take home with them is that a study done earlier in the year looked across a whole bunch of social media platforms and looked at information about the vaccines. Whether that information, was fake or whether, or misleading, or whether it was true. And of the fake and misleading stuff, they managed to track something like 3/4 of it back to just 12 accounts from the USA. So there were basically 12 people who are based in the USA, who have companies associated with them that for years have made millions of dollars a year by selling books or webinars or basically water or sometimes dangerous supplements to tackle various health problems. And when the pandemic arrived, they just pivoted, right? They just pivoted to COVID-19 and sort of started with all their stuff. And so they are basically creating fake or misleading information and sharing it on their platforms because they're trying to sell stuff. And what we know is there are people here in New Zealand who take that information and then they repackage it for different communities here. And that's the stuff that we're seeing. You can't, it's so hard to debunk because there's just no grains of truth in any of it. But people are absolutely convinced that it's true. And one of the reasons they're convinced it's true is because also when you start to look at these kinds of information on social media platforms, the algorithms start to learn what it is that you want to see. And so they start showing you more and more of that stuff. And so you start to get this really warped idea about what's real and what's not real because you're just constantly bombarded with this misinformation. And the way it's packaged is to make you really concerned. It's packaged to make you fearful or make you angry, because that is exactly the kind of information that spreads fastest on the internet. And the reason it's designed that way is because people are making money, the companies themselves, the platforms themselves are making money from all the advertising clicks that you get, right? So that's something to remember, is that information is being created and shared, and it's generally bullshit. But it's very, very hard to pull people out of that when that's all that they see, and it's preying on your fears. So in terms of safety, there are billions of doses of these vaccines now that have been administered around the world. And there are certainly, clinical trials that are still ongoing. They will continue for several years. That's completely normal. And what we're trying to do from those is understand how long do people's immune responses last. But we're now getting huge amounts of information from those billions of doses of their safety and how effective they are in real world situations, right? And what we are finding is that they are pretty damn good, these vaccines, and pretty bloody safe. So there are some very rare complications that come up. So for young people, these are a mild, usually mild kind of impact on the heart, which is very treatable. Basically, if you get the vaccine and in the days or weeks afterwards, you feel like you've got a sore chest or your heart is racing, go and see your health provider because they will be able to look after you. And generally, it's just usual drugs that are needed for this and rest, and that helps. What we know, because of how many millions and millions of people have also had COVID-19, is that all the things that people are worried about with the vaccine happen with COVID-19 in much larger amounts. So if you're worried about the vaccine, be really worried about COVID-19 because that's how you will get these things. So we know you're at increased risk of blood clots, you're increased risk of these heart issues. We're now seeing things like erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, all of these kinds of things associated with infection, not with the vaccines. So we're learning a lot. I know that people are concerned because they haven't been used in people for very long. There's nothing about the way they work that would make us worry about that. The way they work is basically taking something that happens in your cells every single day. It's very, very clever science. And using that to help your immune system to recognize the virus when they see it for real. So the safety, there's big studies going on with, millions of people enrolled that's going to follow them for years now. And as I say, the things that are coming up are things that are very, very, very rare, and things that we know happen when you get COVID-19 and you're much more likely to get them. The other thing to say about safety, so there's a lot of misinformation around vaccine safety because there are platforms around the world that allow people to enter their own data about what happens to them or their family after they get a vaccine. And so what we see is that, people will load stuff on these websites. And then, so in New Zealand, we have one of these websites. And the idea is that every bit of data that gets put into that then gets investigated. So if somebody says, this is what happened to me, or this is what happened to my friend, then it needs to be investigated. Because the thing that we know is that when you're rolling out vaccines, on the kind of timescale that we're doing to millions of people, things happen. Every day, people have heart attacks and, things happen. And so what's really important is being able to say, did something happen to somebody because it would have happened to them anyway, or did it happen because of the vaccine? And that's what investigations find out. But what we see is people take this raw data from these websites, some of which is actually people are just filling it with crap because they're trying to frighten people, right? Mm-hmm. But they take that raw data and say, oh my goodness, look at all this, look at all these things that have happened. And they just simply are not true or not related to the vaccine. So
it's a manipulation of data, isn't it? I mean, it's an age-old problem that we've got. And just to arrest any concerns of people out there, I mean, my goodness, even with my 2 jabs, look, I'm the survivor of 2 heart attacks. I've had high blood pressure. Thank goodness I've dropped 24 kilos in the last few months. But you know what? There's other health struggles that we're facing as a people as well, but this is chief among them right now, especially with the number of children that have been impacted in this last round. I mean, can we talk briefly? If we can just stick to the medical questions before I turn to Tina and Collin again. Can we just stick with this question about the vaccinations for those between the ages of 12 and 16? That's another question that's popped up. I mean, how safe is it for our 12 and 16-year-olds?
So definitely, it's definitely safe. As I say, when we look at the risk to them from having those conditions, so having a blood clot or having heart issues, compared to getting COVID-19, it's much, much lower. So while they are slightly more increased risk than older people of getting it after the vaccine, the cases are generally mild. And that's another thing, is that, you know, that kind of data is again being manipulated. So if you're worried about your heart and you're a young person, then you are much more at risk of a heart problem if you get COVID-19. And it will potentially be a long-term heart problem rather than a short-term mild thing that can be stopped with drugs. That's the thing that really worries me, is that, you know, we most of the world has not even properly seen the impact of COVID yet, because there are so many people who've had it, you know, so many people now with long COVID, and we haven't even seen the things that are going to pop up in the next 2 to 5 years, you know, the number of people who are left with damage that's going to cause long-term impacts. And that's going to have a huge impact on the health system of all these countries. So,
absolutely.
Yeah,
so,
it's
so what we're saying is, as adults, it's our responsibility to get the jab, because essentially we're also protecting our whānau, we're protecting our mokopuna, we're protecting our tamariki, and how we're protecting everybody's children. So it's more than just us getting the jab for us. And you know, getting one in the arm for New Zealand, it's further than that. Hey, Tina, can I bring you in for a moment, and also Collin? Let's have a talk about the what Siouxsie's discussed as well, just about the misinformation and how we're dealing with it in the community. And Collin, in the Pacific community out there in South Auckland, we saw all of a sudden the media were just piling in. And really heaping a whole lot of hoha, quite frankly, on our brothers and sisters out that way, because all of a sudden it was their fault they went to church, which is just ridiculous, because we're all in the same level as everybody else. So Collin and Tina, what are your thoughts on how we address this misinformation within the community, and how we get our people out there to get the jab?
Well, I think Siouxsie's referred to it. I mean, for my understanding of this is that even in the Pacific community, there's a very small, but very vocal and very visible group of people, unfortunately, in our case, young people who are promoting this stuff and sharing it on the social media platform. It's a real challenge, Matt, because providing a fact-based response doesn't wash. These are ideological, predetermined, not based on any sense or rationality or evidence. This is just something that they believe in. But as I say, my understanding is that in fact it's not widespread. It's being promoted by a small group, but obviously they influence community members who are not particularly have easy access to data, if you know what I mean, and they will rely on what they hear. The other thing, of course, is that Pacific communities are taken to Facebook like duck to water, and you know, Facebook is that all conquering authoritative source of information, whether it's real or not. And so on the one hand, it's very good that people do have access to the net and to do things for themselves. The downside, of course, is the stuff. So this is a long-winded response, Matt, because I don't know the answer to your question. I just keep countering, I keep sharing information that I have, I keep referring people to the government websites like the Ministry of Health and so on to listen to their GP and their nurse, and not to take anything that doesn't have any credibility behind it. But of course, it's not possible for everyone to discern what's real and what's you know, fact and what's not. So it's as I say, my understanding is it's a small group, but very visible, very active, and clearly influencing the community. On the upside for me is the fact that our vaccination uptake is improving, and that tells me that people are taking notice of the information that comes through credible sources as well.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you, Collin. Tina, I mean, for Māori, we see, I mean, I've been watching all these TikTok videos. I mean, you've got nothing else to do during lockdown, right? The old TikTok comes out. It's really incredible just to see the weight of numbers now emerging of our people heading out there, putting messages out there, you know, knocking on doors, going and picking up our kaumātua in the van to get them to the sports ground for the vaccination. But what else is driving that hesitancy, though? What more can we be doing?
Well, you know, I think one of the things is that what we can see when we look at particularly the misinformation and particularly the mistrust around information is that there's kind of three pillars that are at play there. There's government, science, and media. And within science, of course, there's the medical profession, the health profession, but also just science in general as well. And all of those spaces, you know, have been sites that have been very abusive of our people in the past. And a lot of what we're actually seeing, it's a really unfortunate thing, but also it's a natural and understandable thing when you consider how those three spaces have maltreated our people now for generations, that there isn't going to be a strong level of trust. But we do have other spaces that we can, you know, trust in terms of the information that's coming through to us. So, you know, for us, we belong to a global Indigenous community as well. And so while people might not be trusting mainstream media or however it is, it's not necessarily the fact that just because information is coming through mainstream media that it's wrong. It's just that we don't have a trustful relationship with it. You can have, you know, just like a mate or a friend or a partner, you cannot trust them, but that doesn't mean every single thing that they say or bear witness to is wrong. It just means that the trust isn't automatically there. So, you know, for us, one of the things that we've seen is that, you know, our First Nations communities really suffered and are still suffering. We've lost some, you know, the 3 members of the Sandy family passed away. Well, 2 of them just in this past week and the 3rd earlier, and they were one of our strong supporters at the UN from the Mohawk Six Nations reservation. They used to come along often, and I would see them often at the UN in New York coming to protest outside the front or to support us in that space. And so, you know, we also have seen overseas that the Pacific community, for instance, in LA has been very heavily hit by COVID. And we know that, you know, regardless of what you might feel about colonial organizations, these are Indigenous communities. And so we've been really just connecting with our Indigenous communities in places that have been heavily hit. And I think, you know, up until now, a lot of the really heavily hit places I've been over in the United States, where those of us who do have relationships with our First Nations communities over there have been able to access those relationships and talk with them. Some of the ones in South America have been so heavily hit and are so oppressed by their governments that we literally cannot get in contact with them anymore. But it's always been quite far away, but now I think that it's hitting quite heavily in Australia. You know, I have 2 nephews that have been tested COVID positive, and a mukupuna now as well, who's COVID positive under 1 year old. And so now I think we're going to start seeing a lot more, and of course all of our whānau over in Fiji as well. So I think now, it's just unfortunate, but we're going to have a lot more kind of direct information coming through from impacted communities that we have connections to. And we really need to listen to them, listen to their experiences. You know, one of my best friends' son, he's a CrossFit champion. He's incredibly fit. He used to play for Illawarra St. George, and has permanent damage now to his stomach from COVID, and definitely won't be carrying on with his sporting career, unfortunately. So, you know, there are still spaces that we don't need to rely on, you know, don't have to kind of try and overcome the survival mechanism of not trusting, you know, for us Pākehā governments in order to be able to assess that information, because it can come from trusted sources such as our Indigenous brothers and sisters in the communities that we do have connections to. The other part that I would say is that, yeah, a lot of the misinformation is generated online and social media. And for us, that it has a huge impact, but that's just one site. So for us here in Matakawa, we were like, well, look at all of the places that we exchange information, trusted information with each other. There's our kura, there's our marae, there's our iwi radio station, there are our staff rooms in different spaces as well. And so we're like, well, how do we utilize those spaces to validate and decide what is good information, and also to share good information that takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of the information scape that misinformation might fill, because misinformation loves information voids. They love information vacuums. They fill it with bad information. So we were like, well, let's just not create those information vacuums.
Absolutely. Can I just reinforce that? It's so interesting, and I'm going to hand over to my co-host. Otherwise, I'm going to get the jandle in a minute for hogging. But the other day we were on the text messages with each other, and one of my brothers had found a special watercress hole. Call it there. You Māoris know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so we're on the text message. Next minute, Brent's on the text. Everyone else is on the text, and by the time you know it, we've moved from talking about watercress. Oh, hang on though. Have you had your jab? Oh, yeah, I've had one jab. Who's had 2 jabs to go down and get the watercress? And you are right about those different forms of mediums that we're using to get information out there. But it's also self-assuring, reassuring that our people are getting the jab, and we're actively talking about, well, go and pick up that bucket of watercress because you got the 2 jabs. Probably also have petrol to put in the car. Hey, Ofeina, can I ask you to now round us out with our final group of questions? I know we're running short for time, and then before we do that, just a massive ups and thanks to the PSA and all of you whānau out there for putting this together, including Janice and Brendan and all the team. Thank you so much. Ofeina, over to you.
Thank you, mate. I think you've done a marvelous job. I think for me, one of the key repetitive things that have come through is around information and communication. And that has been a theme of questions that we've received from some of our participants around what are some of the effective strategies or messaging that needs to be put in place. And I think this is particularly important to also think about from not just our our participants' point of view, but also for PSA as well as an organization or the networks within PSA. And I'd also like for you to think about the effective messaging around vaccination, leveraging of some of the strengths that we have within our communities, our Pacific and Māori cultural values, as well as our worldviews, be it te ao Māori, anga whakatonga, wha Samoa, of the Pasefika way.
Can I start with that then? One of the things that I think we have to keep pushing as the message is that vaccinations are not just about us as individuals, they're about us as a collective. It doesn't matter if you're healthy and you get COVID, you might be fine. Hopefully you will be fine, but you will be infectious before you know it, and you will spread it to other people. So and at the moment, this is our children, this is the people who can't be vaccinated. There will also be people in our communities who are vaccinated, but who haven't made a good antibody response because they might have some other underlying health condition. And we don't know who they are. So somebody might be really well vaccinated and then still get sick. So it's about not just us as individuals, it's about us as a collective. And the PSA is it's a union. This as union members, why are people union members? Because they care about the collective. And I think that's the thing we keep needing to really remind people of, that when you see misinformation, it's often about you as an individual. That's one way you can tell that there's a lot of misinformation. It's about your individual freedoms and rights. And we need to think more about, actually, we are part of a collective. And this is something that your communities do so well, that I think just emphasizing that collective nature is how we get through these things, about caring for each other.
Absolutely. Can I just also, that has been a key part of our strategy, is to also capitalize upon our communal approach. The other thing that I would say, a key thing that we often say in the resistance movements, and we've been a part of advocacy and resistance for a long time now, is for Indigenous peoples, for First Nations peoples, for Pasefika, for Māori, our existence is resistance. That is the primary form of our resistance. to colonial forces, be they economic or whatever kind of colonial forces, is that we must survive. And if we aren't focusing on survival for future generations, nothing else is going to matter. And so this is it's a real challenge out there for us to make sure that we focus on our continued existence as a form of resistance, so that our mokopuna can pick up the challenge for future generations and continue the pathway for us.
I guess I'm a little preoccupied with rangatahi and how do we get young people, because that's our challenge right at the minute. And we've got 2 more days of the Niue event and 2 more days of the Cookie event, and really we want to get out to as many young people as possible. I mean, obviously there are other opportunities for vaccination, but how do we encourage, support, inform, and get our young people to come along and get vaccinated? The other thing, of course, the younger they are, the less likely they are to be vaccinated. I saw this evening that 12-year-olds for all of New Zealand, there's really only been about 4% that's been vaccinated. So a really long way to go. And I think we should use our networks and imagination and creativity to get young people to come along. That to me is my big challenge, and encourage everyone on the Zoom this evening to use your networks and connections to encourage the rangatahi to get vaccinated, protecting themselves, their families, their whānau, their communities, and all of Aotearoa, basically.
Kia ora, everyone. Ko Janice Pānaho taku ingoa. I just wanted to say, as a representative of the PSA, I'm the Kaihotu, but I do agree with you, Collin, in terms of some of the fundamental problems that had existed for our people, and it's the way it's been rolled out in terms of the bureaucratic systems that are in place, that our people don't tend to warm to those. They don't use the system. It's almost like saying, oh, well, you know, we've got internet now. Our people don't have computers. They don't have laptops in the whānau. They're lucky if they have internet. So we have to be more creative and innovative around in terms of how we're going to attract tourists. I sent something to Matt and I said, you know, probably a month's supply of kai might be a good way of actually encouraging our people to get along, to get vaccinated. I know it sounds like bribery, or concert tickets for our rangatahi. Taranaki put on kai this morning in terms of getting the workers out there to get vaccinated and getting a bacon butty. We've got to start thinking what's going to attract our people to be able to come along to get vaccinated. And I think it is up to our iwi too, around the motu, to come together. I'm really pleased to have met you, Tina, and your initiatives down in Ngāti Parau also. Very, you know, wonderful. That's the kind of things that we need to adopt. So yeah, the challenge is out there for us, and I think using the PSA as a platform was one of those things that we thought was necessary for our members and their whānau. So Susie, you're right, it is about the collective, and we've got to start acting as a collective.
Oh, ngā mihi, Janice. I think there's a saying in our Tongan culture, and it talks about, you know, the mawhana, the warmth of a conversation or a dialogue. And I think that with the permission of our panel, Matt, you can continue and ask a few more questions, because just judging by our viewers of Facebook and the participants that are still on here, there would be a few more questions that that our people may still want to be answered from our amazing panel. So I'd like to ask if we could take another 5 to 10 minutes and keep the mawhana, the warmth of our discussion going.
Hey, just a couple more questions to keep the conversation going. Thank you, Ofeina. And it's going to come down to some pointy-end questions again. I'm afraid, Susie, I'm probably going to throw these your way as well. One of them is how long does the vaccine itself last? I want to come back to the vaccine questions come through. How long does the vaccine last? Because that's that period between when you get jab 1, 3 weeks down the line, you get the second jab. And then there was a bit of research apparently that showed that, well, maybe wait a little bit longer. But ultimately, how long does it last in our bodies?
Great question. So I guess maybe if I explain a little bit about how this vaccine works. So in our cells, basically, if we want our cells to make proteins, the recipe for that protein is in our DNA. And so the DNA is kind of kept hidden away in what's called the nucleus, and that's not where proteins are made. So the first thing that our cell has to do is basically make a copy of this recipe. So that recipe is our DNA, and the copy is called mRNA. And that copy is made, and then that copy moves out of the nucleus and into the cell, into these little machines called ribosomes. And then these machines make that recipe into a protein. So what we do with the vaccine is we basically give our cells the recipe, this mRNA, for the spike protein, which is just a very small part of the virus. And what we're just trying to do is to get our ribosomes to make a little bit of that protein so they can show it to our immune system. So the really important thing is that this mRNA is very, very fragile. So in order to get it into our bodies, it's basically wrapped up in little balls of fat. So the ingredients of the vaccine are basically this little recipe, balls of fat, some salt, because we don't want to, if you inject it into your muscle and it's the wrong pH, it makes your muscle cells break up. So it's got salts in it. And then because we keep it at low temperatures, because it's so fragile, we put some sugar in it. So sugar, salt, fat, and then this little bit of recipe mRNA. So that gets injected into your muscle. Basically, the fat help it gets into your cell, and then the mRNA, this recipe, is given to these little ribosome machines, and they make a bit of protein. That mRNA is so fragile that it basically only really hangs around probably for a few hours, maybe a few days. Your cells make these proteins. Your cells are also really clever, and they go, hang on a minute, this is not a human protein, this is a viral protein. So they chop it up, and then they show it to the immune system and say, remember what this is. So that's why you get a sore arm and you have a bit of a fever. That's your immune system kind of kicking off and doing things. And that usually lasts for, maybe a few days after you've had the vaccine, the first dose. And then within a couple of days, the vaccine itself will be gone, and your body will have started basically making this immune response. So we give a second dose because sometimes in some people that first dose doesn't work very well. And so the second dose is basically a kind of a way to go, hey, did you see this? We need you to see this, right? And so when the trials were done, because they were trying to get an answer as soon as possible, they basically made a 3-week gap between getting these 2 doses. It's exactly the same vaccine, exactly the same thing in the 2 doses, but they gave this 3-week gap because we know that it takes about 2 weeks from the first dose for you to start making antibodies. So that extra week gave you a little bit of time. Then we know that so we know the first dose is pretty good, but it's not as good as 2. And 2 doses is way better, right? So no doses is bad, 1 dose is good, 2 doses is awesome. In the UK, they basically changed their strategy because they were having this massive, massive outbreak. And so what they decided was they would give as many people as possible 1 dose of the vaccine, and they would wait a bit longer to give the second dose. And what they found was giving a longer wait between the doses meant that you actually had antibodies that will probably last longer. So that's why we've changed the advice now from being 3 weeks to 6 weeks, because that looks like you'll make antibodies that hang around, that basically keep you protected for longer. And they've also found that actually mixing up the vaccines also seems to be good, because they were using a vaccine that's not as good as the one that we're using. And they found that if people had 1 dose of that not so great vaccine and then they boosted it with Pfizer, that gave them a really good response. So what we know is that basically to be fully protected takes basically a week after you've had your second dose. And if you leave more than 3 weeks between the doses, you'll hopefully have antibodies that last for longer. But the vaccine itself, that thing that gets injected into your arm, lasts no more than a few hours or a few days.
All right, there you go. That's now we're going to do a quick fly around because I'm conscious of time. I'm going to get you good people off to a good night's sleep. So I'm going to call this the drum roll round with Siouxsie Wiles. You like that one? Everyone gets a drum roll now. Hey, so Siouxsie, let's have a quick fire round before I get to Collin and Tina. The current COVID-19, the Pfizer vaccine, does it protect against other variants?
Yeah, it's pretty good. So basically we know at the moment that the antibodies definitely protect against Delta, which is the major one that's going around at the moment. there's a new variant in South America that doesn't seem to be taking over, that when in the studies looks like you have a little bit less of a response, but it looks like the response is still good enough. So at the moment, everything that's out there, these vaccines work just fine against.
Now, this is going to seem strange, but I think these two questions are important because it also deals with some of the misinformation potentially that's out there. Two questions, I'll put them to you. Quick fire around Siouxsie again. How transmissible is COVID-19 between dogs, in your professional opinion? And the other one that we've got in here, and I know this might be a little bit out there, but let's put it anyway. Do you believe COVID-19 can be transmitted by mosquito? Now, you know, that one.
Okay, so mosquito, no, definitely not. Dogs, so animals can get it from humans. And there's only documented evidence of mink giving it back to humans, getting it from humans and then giving it back. I've not heard of any documented cases of a dog or a cat giving it back to humans, but they catch it from their humans.
Wow.
Right, awesome. See, that was really quick, so thank you very much for that. I think that's all my questions I've got going, Ofeina, for the quick fire round with Siouxsie. I think it's really time just to find out what our key critical messages are, Ofeina, from our panel. You know, what are we trying to do here in terms of get our whānau out there? What message can we send them to wind their arms up, you know, their sleeves up and get the jib jab, but more importantly, for our tamariki and our mokopuna. So I'll hand it over to you, Ofeina.
Thank you so much for that, Matt. Yeah, I guess it's just our closing remarks from our panelists. And I'd like to start with Collin, and then we'll go to Tina, and then last words to our Dr. Wiles.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been fantastic to be part of this Kōrero Talanoa this evening. My message to the Pacific communities, particularly young people, is to get vaccinated, get the vaccination, get the vaccine, and do what you can to get people vaccinated. My message to officials is that this idea that we would abandon the elimination strategy is reckless and irresponsible. Until we have acceptable levels of vaccination for Māori and Pacific and our other vulnerable communities, it is simply unacceptable for the business community and others to push government to abandon the elimination strategy. I have to say that I am absolutely amazed at how poor understanding of some of the media people are about our elimination strategy. Our elimination strategy is what got us this far. There's no doubt that we have to revise our plan depending on how things evolve. But to say that elimination strategy has not worked is just a really poor understanding of basic principles, I think. So sorry, that's the rant and the sermon. It's all over. And I just want to say thank you very much, Ofeina, to PSA and all the members, the work that you do. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much.
When you think about what our tipuna have been through, it's pretty mind-blowing what they have survived over time. And they did that for us. They survived for us. They did that thinking about the future generations and the survival of our people. And you know, like I said, 73 pandemics and epidemics since the early 1800s until now. And for much of that time, they didn't have access to vaccines. I wish they did. I wish we could have gone back and helped our ancestors and helped our Indigenous ancestors around the world to be able to survive that. But we didn't, and they paid such a severe price. But we're still here today because of those who fought and survived and made the decisions, the right decisions, the practical decisions for the survival of our people across time. So just like they thought about us, we must also think about the future generations. We must also think about each other, think communally, think about our children and what our children need us to do, think about what our ancestors need us to do, think about what our future generations need us to do. And all of that points towards vaccination. All of that points towards us utilising all the tools that we can get access to continue that legacy of surviving and yeah, planning for the future. That's I guess that would be my final remarks.
And I guess my final remarks are, so yes, like Collin, thank you to all the members for everything you're doing. Everybody has to just talk to their family and friends, you know, explain why you have chosen to be vaccinated, find out what it is that's worrying them about the vaccine. And as Tina says, you know, talk about future generations. There is not a huge global conspiracy of people, you know, using the vaccine for anything other than trying to save lives. There are people out there who are trying to disrupt our vaccine rollout. They are the bad ones. And they do this thing called love bombing, where they basically make you scared and then they kind of tell you that but they love you and everything. And so we have to push against that, right? Really look at what agendas people are pushing. And you know, information that's designed to make you scared is not information that's designed to help you make good decisions.
Hey, thank you. Before I hand it over to Ofeina and our team at the PSA to close off, can I also just add some final remarks? What an absolute honour and privilege it is to have Tina, Collin and Dr Siouxsie here with us this evening, whānau. But even more so, it's a privilege to be able to facilitate this conversation with an organisation such as the PSA that does incredible work to advocate on behalf of its members. And more importantly, their objective in putting this hui together tonight is to keep you safe. And you know, whānau, I don't have to say that because I'm not even a member and I ain't even being paid. I'm doing it because this is what we need to do as a collective in the spirit of kotahitanga to get the message out there. No matter where you are across Aotearoa, no matter your ethnic grouping, no matter your rohi, your iwi, your hapu, what island you might come from, Tina made a really good point about survival. More than 2,000 of our people, of Māori, died in the epidemic in 1918, 1919, out of roughly about 8,000 people in New Zealand who passed away. People didn't want to go into our communities back then. People didn't want to help us. In large parts, we were left to our own devices. And we did everything we could because it was about survival. Today, it's also about survival. The survival of our people, survival of our culture, of Te Reo Māori, of all of these things, of just the spirit of whānau. But more importantly, the key to this is thriving. In order to thrive, we first must have to have survived. And this is the goal here. And that's why it's so important to get our whānau out there and get the jab in those arms. And please don't listen to the, the misinformation that's out there. Look at me. I'm the survivor of 2 heart attacks, high blood pressure, walking poster child with blood pressure medication. I had the double jab and I'm still standing. Mind you, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that would love to see me rolled over by a concrete mixer, but it ain't going to happen a month of Sundays. So thank you, whānau. And I'd like to hand it back to our colleagues at the PSA and Ofeina. And thank you, Hone, thank you, Janice, and thank you, the entire team. Kia ora.
Brilliant, kia ora. Ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Just want to echo your sentiments, Matthew, and thanking our amazing panel, and thank you for this opportunity to the PSA Te Rūnanga as well as PSA Pasefika. I think this is just the beginning of making sure that we have access to really good information so that we ourselves, our employees, our employers, and our network and our union movement, and whoever else who chooses to participate, have access to information. So that really good information and the right information so that they can make informed choices to protect themselves and their whānau as well. So we started off with a karakia, and I'd like for us to end with a karakia. So I'll hand it over to our matua. Malo.
Kia ora tātou. Look, I just want to acknowledge all you, the leaders of our communities, the professionals, and for your contribution tonight, as you've put it, Matthew, for survival. And you know, the big goal is to get vaccinated. So thank you for your words of encouragement, and for all yous who are real leaders in our communities. and who do the hard work every day. Susie, I see you on television every day. I feel like getting my hair dyed like yours. What's left of it? But anyway, all the best. God bless everybody, and we hope to see you again sometime in the future and to talk again about what we have done. Nō reira, I runga te ingoa o te matua, te tamata wairua tapu. Amen. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, kia ta whai o tō tātou ariki o Ukraiti, me te aroha o te atu. Whiwinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu. Ake, ake. Amen. Kia ora tātou.
Amen.